This is John Gever with MedPage Today in New Orleans for the American Society of Hematology's annual meeting. Clinicians at Johns Hopkins Medical Center in Baltimore noticed that some patients with sickle cell disease and the H1N1 flu were having an especially difficult time. That turned into a study reported here by Dr. John Strouse.
This study was to look at seasonal influenza and epidemic influenza, or the swine origin H1N1 influenza, in children and young adults with sickle cell disease. This question came up because we had several patients that had severe infections with influenza in the setting of sickle cell disease once the H1 epidemic began over the summer. And this made us want to compare that experience to the experience that we had had prior with patients with seasonal influenza. The way we did this study was that we identified children that had either seasonal influenza or H1 influenza from a review of discharge records as well as laboratory records. And then for the 2008 and 2009 influenza season, we kept a record of patients coming to the emergency department or admitted with influenza-like illness. By doing this surveillance and then a review of our medical records, both electronic and paper, we were able to look at the severity of illness in these two groups. What we found was that influenza was frequent. From the period from 1993 through November of 2009, we identified a total of 90 cases of seasonal influenza, the majority being influenza A, 65 cases, or influenza B, 25 cases, in addition to 28 cases of H1N1 influenza. Obviously, all the cases of H1N1 influenza were since May of 2009, since this virus wasn't circulating earlier. The majority of those cases were confirmed in our state lab by reverse transcriptase PCR. When we looked at the severity of the cases, we first identified that the children and young adults with H1N1 influenza were older, with an average age of 9 versus 4 years. But we also identified that there were increased proportion of children and young adults that had acute chest syndrome. It was nearly a third of the patients with H1N1 influenza versus 12% of the patients that had seasonal influenza. Along with that, we saw increased rates of transfusion with a similar difference between groups, as well as an increased rate of, or proportion, that were admitted to the intensive care unit. It was 14% of the children and young adults with sickle cell disease and H1N1 influenza versus 2% of those without.
And some of these results were statistically significant, right, which is pretty remarkable given the small number of H1N1 patients.
They were for acute chest syndrome, the patients admitted to the ICU, transfusion, and ventilatory support, as well as the differences in age. And I think these results reflect that this virus, H1N1 influenza, appears to be more severe in children and young adults with sickle cell disease, as we're seeing in the general population.
And what is it about sickle cell disease that that makes this worse in them?
I think that part of it has to do with just how we approach sickle cell disease. If you come in with a fever, you really get evaluated very carefully, and we admit more patients to the hospital with fever. And then I think the other process is once you have pulmonary infiltrate, once you start getting some lung injury, you're more likely to have sickling and more lung injury. So we had several patients that developed quite severe acute chest syndrome, presumably starting as a viral pneumonia and then progressing because of increased sickling secondary to hypoxemia.
In New Orleans, I'm John Gever, MedPage Today.